California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Chapter 11. An Unjust Legal System. V. Incarceration. History. The history of criminalization of African Americans since slavery and the inequities in policing, trials, and sentencing have resulted in an overrepresentation of African Americans in jails and prisons, a phenomenon known as mass incarceration, as this chapter has described. American society began to criminalize African Americans starting from the era of slavery through black codes, vagrancy laws, and segregation laws. Further, law and order, or tough on crime, political campaigns in the 20th century resulted in particularly punitive sentencing and parole systems, which have led to the imprisonment of large numbers of African Americans, although correctional authorities did not always uniformly collect data on the race of prisoners. There is evidence from the U.S. Department of Justice showing that African Americans have comprised a percentage of prisoners exceeding their percentage of the population outside of correctional facilities, from at least 1926 to 1986, 324. The percentage of prisoners admitted to state and federal institutions who are black has consistently grown, and which general population trends cannot explain. 325. Although the imprisonment rate of African Americans has generally decreased since 2006. 326 African Americans continue to be overrepresented both nationwide and in California in adult incarceration, solitary confinement, capital punishment, and juvenile incarceration. Adult incarceration. The United States has the highest imprisonment rate, the number of people in prison or jail as a percentage of its total population, in the world. 327. Numerous academics, activists, and politicians have called for an end to mass incarceration, and there have been reforms in several states such as Texas, Kansas, Mississippi, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Ohio. 328. These reforms largely focus on reducing excessive prison sentences. However, advocates argue that these efforts are not sufficient to undo decades of prison expansion. 329. One study estimates that at current rates, it will take 72 years to cut the U.S. prison population in half. 330. Despite reforms, African Americans continue to be overrepresented in prisons nationwide. 20% of prisoners in federal and state correctional facilities were African Americans, even though they made up just 13.4% of the population in 2019. 331. In 2021, African Americans comprise 38.3% of people in federal prisons across the country. 332. In addition to overrepresentation of African Americans in correctional facilities, federal and state officials continue to use the labor of incarcerated people. 333. In fact, some present-day prisons where incarcerated people still perform labor are on land that was once a plantation where enslaved people worked before the Civil War, and where southern states similarly enslaved African Americans after the Civil War through convict leasing. 334. Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary shows how, in some ways, the American correctional system continues the legacy of slavery. 335. Angola, which is currently outside of present-day Baton Rouge, was originally a plantation named for the African country from which most of its enslaved people were trafficked. 336. After the Civil War and abolition of slavery, former Confederate Major Samuel Lawrence James received a lease of Louisiana State Penitentiary and all its incarcerated individuals. 337. Under this lease, James subleased the majority of black people who were incarcerated to landowners to replace enslaved people, while others continued to work on levees, railroads, and road construction, while others were given clerical and craftsmanship work. 338 later. There were also attempts to industrialize prison labor by forcing incarcerated people to make shoes and clothing. 339 in 1898. The state of Louisiana banned convict leasing and, in 1901, the state of Louisiana purchased the prison camp and resumed control of its prisoners. 340 more recently. Incarcerated people in Angola continue to engage in production to sell goods such as growing crops like wheat, corn, soybeans, cotton, milo, 341 sugar cane, 342 and even producing art. 343 to this day. Approximately 65% of incarcerated people in Angola are African Americans. 344. Correctional facilities, such as the federal prisons industries of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, argue that these programs teach marketable job skills. 345 but some academics argue that these work programs are not beneficial. 346. One study has found that while black and white incarcerated people were equally likely to break rules, correctional authorities were more likely to report infractions by black people. 385. Chapter 11. An unjust legal system. Correctional discipline. African Americans also experience discrimination in the correctional disciplinary system. At least one study has found that while black and white incarcerated people were equally likely to break rules, correctional authorities were more likely to report infractions by black people. 347. There is an overrepresentation of African Americans in solitary confinement. Scholars have defined solitary confinement as when correctional facility officials separate incarcerated people from the general population and hold them in their cells for an average of 22 hours or more per day for 15 continuous days or more. 348. A 2018 study showed that both federal and state correctional facilities placed large numbers of black males in solitary confinement. Black males in prison made up approximately 42.5% of the prison population but comprised 46.1% of the people in solitary confinement. Juvenile incarceration. African Americans are also overrepresented in the juvenile justice system as discussed in Chapter 8. Pathologizing the black family. American culture tends to see black children not as children, but as adults. Black students are subject to discipline at a higher rate than other groups in schools nationwide in 43 states and the District of Columbia. Black students are arrested at higher levels relative to their percentage of the population. 349. There is also evidence that these racial disparities in school-based disciplinary actions are associated with county-level rates of racial bias. 350. This sort of disciplinary actions and bias contribute to how African Americans are eventually pushed to incarceration through the school-to-prison pipeline, as described in Chapter 6, Separate and Unequal Education, and Chapter 8, Pathologizing the Black Family. Black youth comprise 41% of youth in juvenile facilities even though they make up 15% of all youth in America. 351. Black youth are more than 4 times as likely to be detained or committed in juvenile facilities as their white peers. 352. Black youth are more likely to be in custody than white youth in every state except Hawaii. 353. As a result of their experiences with the juvenile justice system, many African Americans distrust the system. 354. This report further discusses the enduring impact of the juvenile justice system on black families in Chapter 8, Pathologizing the Black Family. California. The previously described history of the criminal justice system in America, such as California three strikes laws and similar policies that have affected large numbers of African Americans, has led to several conditions that have caused California to lead the way in expansion of prisons in the United States until recent reforms that history, particularly from the 1980s to present, has contributed to what has been described as the biggest prison building project in the history of the world. Here in California 355, the city of Los Angeles imprisons more people than any other American city, 356 according to one scholar. Law enforcement officials often arrested, incarcerated, and/or instructed African Americans to leave Los Angeles during the 1920s and 1930s, 357. African Americans are overrepresented in correctional facilities. Approximately 28.3% of California's prisoners were black, when they make up about 6% of the population. 358 further. Black people who are incarcerated in California correctional facilities also experience forms of segregation from the moment they enter a facility. 359. California has a history of extremely poor conditions in its numerous prisons, which disproportionately harms African Americans, as they are more likely to be in prison and to serve longer sentences due to systemic racism like the federal government. California still houses and invests in the incarceration of people in large numbers. It houses approximately 100,000 people in its facilities, has forecasted a budget of approximately $227.2 billion for 2021-22, and operates 35 adult facilities. In a 2011 U.S. Supreme Court case called Plata v. Brown, the court ordered the state of California to reduce its prison population because the medical and mental health care in California prisons was so bad that it violated the U.S. Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. 360. Since the decision in 2011, California has been required to decrease the number of people in state correctional facilities. 361. Later that year, the state passed Assembly Bill 109. Which reduced overcrowding in state facilities by shifting incarceration responsibilities from state to local authorities for certain people convicted of low-level offenses. California also passed several other laws to reduce its prison population, including Proposition 36 limits California's 3 strikes law to serious or violent felonies for third strike offenders and establishing a process for third strike offenders to ask a court to reduce their term under certain circumstances. Assembly Bill 2942 allows courts to resentence a defendant on the recommendation of district attorneys. Senate Bill 567 requires criminal courts to only impose a maximum term if a jury considers aggravating facts regarding the offense and permits a criminal defendant and other parties to dispute facts in the record or present additional facts for the purposes of sentencing. Senate Bill 73 ended the prohibition against probation and suspended sentencing for certain types of drug offenses. Assembly Bill 484 changes the requirement that a person who is granted probation after being convicted of furnishing or transporting certain controlled substances serve 180 days in a county jail as a condition of probation. Senate Bill 136 ended a sentence enhancement that added an extra year for anyone convicted of committing a felony for each prior prison or felony jail time they already served. Assembly Bill 32 prohibits California, as a state, from entering into or renewing a contract with a private for-profit prison to incarcerate people. Other laws attempt to end private financial incentives to incarcerate large numbers of people in correctional facilities. Assembly Bill 2542, or the Racial Justice Act, prohibits the use of race, ethnicity, or national origin to seek or obtain convictions or impose sentences. The Racial Justice Act is also an attempt to address previous court decisions and systemic issues in the state state's criminal justice system, which have made it nearly impossible for criminal defendants to challenge racial bias. 362. Many of these laws are new, so it is difficult to evaluate their impact on African Americans. While individuals serve their prison sentences, the state of California uses their labor in many ways. The California Prison Industry Authority produces myriad products such as clothing, furniture, cleaning products, and food. 363. They also perform a wide range of duties in areas such as laundry, kitchen, and general maintenance. 364. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection employed around 1,600 incarcerated individuals to fight forest fires in May 2021. 365. As previously discussed, some scholars have challenged the value of these programs because they do not necessarily provide incarcerated people with marketable job skills. Incarcerated individuals are often tasked with low-skill work, and obtaining a job as a firefighter can be particularly difficult, even for people without criminal records. 366. Although California has attempted to reform its juvenile justice system in recent years, it has a well-documented and troubled history of juvenile incarceration. 367. The number of incarcerated youth reached unprecedented heights in the 1990s. 368. California housed over 10,000 youth in 11 facilities throughout the state in 1996. 369. Since that time, the state has attempted to make several systemic reforms to not only reduce the population of incarcerated youth but also to improve the treatment of youth who are in such facilities. 370. There have also been recent attempts to decentralize the juvenile justice system and provide localized services for juveniles who are accused of crimes. 371. To that end, most recently, Senate Bill 823 provided for the closure of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Division of Juvenile Justice, formerly the California Youth Authority, and established the Office of Youth and Community Restoration in the California Health and Human Services Agency. 372. In 2011, the medical and mental health care in California prisons was so bad that the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the state to immediately reduce its prison population because the living conditions grossly violated the U.S. Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. But many racial inequities for young African Americans remain. Currently, in California, black youth are 3 times more likely to be committed to imprisonment in the state's juvenile justice system than white youths. As of June 2020, of the total 782 youth in California juvenile detention facilities, 227 were black. In that same time, black youth made up 36% of those committed to a juvenile detention facility, even though they comprised only 14% of the population in California. The treatment of black youth as criminals in California begins at an early age when they are in school. School administrators, teachers, and school police often treat young black students as criminals, as Jacob Jackson testified at the October 12, 2021 task force hearing. He was targeted by his teacher and school police when he was a student at Crenshaw High School in Los Angeles. 373. More information on the juvenile justice system in California is available in Chapter 8, Pathologizing the Black Family.